One of the more challenging parts about teaching in front of a church week in, week out is the fact that there's just a broad scope of people listening. And so in the room right now are people who haven't been to church, probably right now, that haven't been to church in months or years or don't have much of a church background at all. And then you've got people that have been just completely consumed with Christianity from the time of their birth, pretty much. And so it can be challenging to come up with something to talk about that relates to everybody. But we are a church that markets as a church for not-so-churchy people. And so I want to make sure that at least periodically we very much honor that we recognize that not everybody speaks the lingo. I'd like that to be kind of universal about how we approach ministry completely. But that every now and then we do a sermon that just kind of breaks things down and gets down to the level of the not-so-churchy, people who haven't grown up in church. And hopefully even those sermons will minister to and make a difference for those that did grow up in church and have been connected to Christianity for a long time. But today we're talking about Christian spirituality for the not-so-churchy, and specifically I'm going to talk about how we're more than meat. If you take a materialistic view that there is no God, that God is not involved, we can view us as a collection of particles, as energy that is existing in the universe. And when we talk about that, partially what we're talking about is what some people would call us as brain slaves. And it's the concept that you have this about 3 to 3.5 pound tissue in your head, trapped in your skull, and that's where it's at. That's where everything goes on, are these electrical signals going on between your two ears. And the great philosopher Morpheus once said, so 3 of you got that, okay, I appreciate that. He said, electrical signals interpreted by your brain. This is the world that you know. All that you know is what you sense. And this dismisses some areas of metaphysics that I think Morpheus is wrong here. But it does make sense that everything we process, we pick up through our eyes, our brain translates and then sends to our consciousness. Everything we touch, everything we smell. Our knowledge of existence in some ways is trapped in that brain of ours. And really what it comes down to is all it is a bunch of electricity. All it is energy releasing. Dr. Greg Boyd said it like this. He said, you only know what's going on outside because of what's going on inside. I want to make it clear from the beginning that I feel, I'm going to talk about neuroscience and metaphysics a little bit today. And I was telling one of my friends right before the service that I've rarely been more uncomfortable sharing on a topic. And I just want to make it clear that I'm not an expert in this field. I'm basically going to kind of word vomit on you guys about stuff I think about where this topic is concerned. I'm just going to talk about the brain and talk about how fascinating it is, and then hopefully tie that into some Christian theology towards the end. But even the scientists, even the best of the best, don't really understand this process of neurology and consciousness and personhood. There was a movie of Star Trek called The Voyage Home years and years ago, and in that movie, this guy, Dr. Leonard McCoy, is walking through a hospital. They've traveled back in time from the future, and so they're in what would be an ancient hospital to them. And there's this woman laying in a gurney, and she's suffering, and she says to him, "Can you help me?" Because he's dressed in doctor's robes or doctor's garb. And she says, "Can you help me?" And he says, "Well, what can I do?" And she says, "I'm here for dialysis." And he says this quote, he says, "Dialysis? What is this, the Dark Ages?" And he says, "Here, take this pill." And he gives her one pill, and she swallows it. And then later on in the movie, you see her being carted down the hall in a wheelchair, just, I'm okay. And all the doctors are following behind her saying, she's completely okay, she's totally fine. And the illustration is that in the future, science will be completely different than what it is now. And that was the point they were making, is that, in the year 2500, you'll look back at dialysis and say, it's like we look at putting leeches on us now. We're like, leeches? Is this the Dark Ages? And when it comes to neuroscience, there have been incredible breakthroughs in even the last 2 decades. But the reality is we're still very, very limited in what we understand. MRIs are kind of caveman science in a sense when it comes to really understanding what goes on in the brain. So I say all that to say I'm unqualified. The science ain't fantastic, but it's still very interesting, and I'm going to talk about it, and you guys can tune me out if you want to. Here's what we figure goes on in the brain all the time. You've got about what they call 10 million of what they describe as neurons in your brain. And neurons are nervous system cells. And you've got about 10 billion of them. And there's about 10 trillion connections between all these cells that go on in that skull of yours. And each of these neurons fire on different patterns and create what they call a neurological net. And that neurological net fires depending on what the external stimuli is that you're responding to. And so it processes, and this is pretty ironic if you think about it. It's completely ironic that the brain works at an unthinkable speed processing unthinkable information. You can't possibly move at the speed of your brain. This is wild stuff to think about. Your brain processes stuff like a microcomputer constantly, all the time, every single second. It's doing stuff that you could not even possibly fathom. And then it processes all that information, and it spits something out to your consciousness. Your consciousness is only receiving a tiny, tiny fraction of what that computer is doing every single second. But it's neurons in a neurological web. And so the way it works is if an event happens, you're listening to my voice right now, and sound waves are traveling from the speakers to your ears and partially from my voice to your ears. And your ears are processing that information, those sound waves, just the change in the atmosphere. Your ears are picking up on that. And your brain is going, whoa, hold on, and going crazy with that information. And it has to access your memory, it has to access your language files, it has to access all of that and spit out meaning to you at the same pace that I'm talking. It's absolutely shocking what the brain is capable of. And you have what is called the reticular activating system. And what the reticular activating system is that system that sorts. So you take all the puzzle pieces of all the stimuli going on around you right now, all the lights, all the feelings, all the smells, all the sounds, and what your reticular activation system does is it takes all that 100 million bits of information every single second, and it determines what's important. It determines what you ought to be paying attention to. And my understanding is that it processes and eliminates about 98% of all that stimuli. Your consciousness only gets about 2% of what the world is shoving at you at any given time. So we can look at things like my voice. Right now, many of you are focused on my voice. Some of you are focused on the fact that we're eating Mexican after the service. I get that. Some of you are focused on the voice. Some of you, your reticular activation system has you on Mexican food at this point. Some of you are focused on the screenshot. You're thinking, why does this guy have dandruff in a professional picture like that? That doesn't make any sense to me. You're not hearing a word I'm saying, but your reticular activation system's like, get that dandruff off that dude's shoulder, right? Now, if I mention your butt in the chair, most of you were not conscious of the feeling of the butt against your chair until I said it. And then your reticular activation system processed the way language works, heard what I was saying, and said, the speaker must be onto something here. Oh, I better check my butt. And you start thinking about your butt. But do you see that a minute ago, your butt was not in your consciousness? You weren't even thinking about it. You weren't even processing it until it ended up on the screen, until I said it out loud. That's the reticular activation system. It's bringing forward what's important. The cadence of your breath. Most of us, we can go weeks and weeks and weeks without ever thinking about our breathing. But there's a portion of our brain in that neurological net that's keeping that thing going all the time. It's sending the neurological impulses to make those lungs go in and out. And it's part of this process that our consciousness doesn't connect with. It's absolutely fascinating, in my opinion. My wife is reading a book called Loving the Little Years right now by Rachel Jankovic, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And she read a portion of this book that she thought was important enough to share with me. And the way the teaching went, she was talking about having multiple kids and the chaos that surrounds having multiple kids. So what happens when you have one kid and the kid puts his feet up on the coffee table, or you tell the kid to get his shoes on so that we can go to the zoo or whatever, and he delays getting his shoes on? It's not a big deal. You just say, hey man, come on, get your shoes on. But when you've got 3 kids in the house and one has got his feet propped up and one is not putting his shoes on and one is painting on or drawing with crayon on the door upstairs, chaos, right? And it creates a chaotic environment that it can be hard for parents to exist in. And so what she talks about is the importance of recognizing that each of your children are an individual. Because what happens in that situation where he's not putting his shoes on, the kid's drawing in crayon, the other one's got his feet propped up where he shouldn't have his feet propped up, the chaos creates the situation where we say, what is wrong with you, man? Get your shoes. How many times have I told you to put your shoes on? And we get a little more irritated and angry with each individual child for what they're doing because they're part of this collective mess. And what she says is that you should approach each child as an individual and the actions of each child as an individual, and it will help you calm down. So when he doesn't have his shoes on, we just recognize that he's 8 years old and kids get sidetracked, and we say, hey man, go get your shoes on, go get your shoes on. But if it's all part of that mess, then we lose our cool, we lose our peace. So Kara shares this with me. Now, let me tell you what this has to do with the brain. How did all this information get to me? She was looking at a book, and her brain not only was accessing the visual stimuli, so the optical stuff was coming in upside down in our nerves, is my understanding, and the brain flips it on its right side and then goes through that information and decides on what's important. So she's not focused on the stuff in her top peripheral vision. She's focused on that book. And she sees some letters. And those letters, the brain accesses this file that's up there. It's not even actually a file. It's just like an explosion of electricity in her brain that's stored somewhere in that gray goo. And it accesses those letters, and it makes those letters mean something. And it says, these letters, when put together just like this, because of your memory, because of your entire childhood growing up, learning to read, the brain says this is what you want to know when you see these letters. And then it takes those letters and it forms words, and it takes those words and it forms sentences, and it takes those sentences and forms paragraphs and gives meaning. And the brain sorts all that. And then the brain, the reticular activation system, switches to the kids. And so now she's reading the book, but she's applying what she's reading to her kids. And all of a sudden, the brain starts accessing the files on the kids and churning information, saying 98% of this we don't need to think about right now, but let's think about this 2%. And it hands it to her. And then her consciousness somehow, and this is where things get really, really fascinating to me. Her consciousness somehow makes a decision. And somehow that decision is tied somewhere else in her neurological net as far as her volition, her will has to decide which of the 2% I'm receiving is the really important part. And apparently something in her volition, which I'm going to call her spirit, something in her spirit says this part is important when it comes to child rearing. And all that process happened like that. All of it happened just, we don't even think about thinking. And her volition chose that part was important and important enough to share with me. And then we get into the whole language thing once again. When she's talking to me and I'm having to sort out, am I thinking about lunch, or am I thinking about what my wife's telling me right now? Am I thinking about my kids, or am I thinking about something selfish? Do I agree with what she's talking about? And it's two brains now working together across neural nets. It's mind-blowing, ironically. And it seems to me like the volition, this sorting process happens, but then there's part of us, there's part of me that gets to decide how I respond. And I'll give you an example. I'm not a caffeine drinker right now because caffeine just messes me up. If I drank caffeine right now, I would be awake until next Sunday. It just totally dominates me. And I'm an addict where caffeine is concerned. I could drink it today, and I'll love it. I will be closer to God this afternoon than I have been in years. I will. I'll hear His voice. I'll understand the deep things of theology. And then tonight, that'll all fade away, and I'll just be this schmo sitting on the couch watching Top Chef. But it does something for me. But if I drink it today, 2 days from now, I'm going to be an absolute grump, unless I keep taking it. And then I have to take more. And I'm going to be an absolute grump if I drink it today. But here's the interesting thing. So that's biochemical. This caffeine gives me an adrenaline surge. It causes my brain, my neurons to go into hyperactivity and work really, really well for a little while. And then I come back 2 days later and I just hate everybody. I'm just grumpy, and I got a headache, and I want to be left alone, and I'm tired, and I don't feel close to God. But what's so interesting to me is because I'm aware, I'm self-aware, because I'm aware that is my body's response to caffeine, those biochemical processes somehow can be controlled by me. And it doesn't mean I don't feel grumpy, but it means I can lay on the couch and moan with my headache and think, I will not treat my kids poorly today based on what I recognize as being biochemical. And so somehow this volition thing, I can recognize, not always, but to a certain extent, we can all be kind of aware of what goes on in our brains, and we can defeat it. If you know, for example, that you get lonely, you can, in some sense, volitionally rise up and beat that to an extent. And I'm not dismissing mental illness, I'm not dismissing medicine, but I'm saying somehow our volition, which I'm calling the spirit, and our biochemistry are not the same, but they're interconnected. So Morpheus says, And this is kind of my question to you. He says, electrical signals interpreted by your brain. This is the world that you know. Greg Boyd said, you only know what's going on outside because of what's going on inside. So here's my question. In this sentence, who is you? When it says you only know because of the brain, what does that mean? When I say your brain, whose brain? Because technically, if we're all just meat, shouldn't we just say the brain? Shouldn't we just say the brains that are in these bodies, that are in these seats? Or do we actually want to ascribe some kind of spiritual personhood to people? And Christian theology teaches the latter. It teaches that we ought to ascribe a spirit to bodies, that we are more than meat, that volition is actually kind of a separate thing, that they're interestingly attached, but they're not the same. So who is hearing my voice right now? Who is looking at the screenshot? Who is aware of their butt in the chair? Is it just an electrical process, or is there a transcendent self underneath it? Who decided that it was important to share the information about the book and that it was important to treat our kids a certain way? Was it just neurons firing, or was there a spirit or a will underneath it? Who is aware that coffee makes them grumpy and can adjust their behavior patterns accordingly and thus control which neurons fire? Who does that? Now, I recognize that people will debate forever and ever on this topic, based on whether you're a materialist or a spiritualist, based on whether what you believe is how you will approach these questions. But I think it's fair to say that it's smart to ascribe spirithood to persons. Let's talk about teleology and turtles very briefly. There have been some studies that show that even atheist children who are raised as atheists ascribe what they call teleology to life. And teleology is kind of the study of purpose. So if there's a rock outcropping in the desert and it's overarching this little area that looks kind of like a cave, I can look at that rock overhang and I can say, the purpose of that overhang is to protect people when it rains. That's teleology. I'm ascribing teleology to the rock outcropping. But we all know that a rock is just a rock, that there is no real purpose to the outcropping. But instead, we would describe it would probably be more accurate to describe it as having function. We would say it's just a rock, but one of the functions of a rock could be to shelter people from the rain. Now, when it comes to turtles, you take even atheist children, children who have been raised by materialists, and you say to an atheist child or a theist child, doesn't matter, you say, what is the purpose of a turtle shell? And what are they going to say? Protect the turtle, right? It's almost unavoidable that in our daily life we speak in terms of teleology. Why? What do the fins of the turtle do? The fins help the turtle swim. However, if this world is just a material world, there is no difference between the turtle and the rock outcropping. There is no teleology. The shell is just a shell. It was not designed with any kind of a purpose. It is just a thing that happens to have function. And depending on how you view the world, but my point is this. It's natural to speak in teleological terms. It's natural to say the turtle's shell is to protect the turtle. It's simple. It's easy. Einstein said this about our consciousness. He said, a human being limited in time and space experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. My understanding is that Einstein was probably a deist, so he took kind of a material view of the universe, even though he thought possibly an intellect was involved in the beginning of it. But he says that consciousness is just a delusion. I heard this quote this week. It says, under materialism, meaning we're nothing but meat, we are a collection of particles interacting in such a way as to produce electrical impulses that generate self-awareness in a situation with no transcendent self, but rather the illusion of such. And then that begs the question, who is being eluded? So if you go back to Einstein's quote, he says, we have the delusion of consciousness. Who? Who is deluded? Who is experiencing this delusion of consciousness? I think it's an important question to ask. So here's my point. That we are spirits and bodies is both elegant and axiomatic. And the question is, who is the subject of cogito ergo sum? So I'll break this down for you. It's elegant in the fact that this is how we naturally talk. We naturally talk about the shell of the turtle being to protect the turtle. We naturally talk about you having a brain, you having a body. It's elegant, it's natural, it's what comes out simply. It's very simple to just say, well, maybe there is something to this spiritual stuff. But it's also axiomatic in the sense that there are truths that require very, very little to no proof. Anybody know what cogito ergo sum means? It's Latin. Anybody break that down? I think, therefore I am. This is one of the most axiomatic truths there is. But if you approach it from a materialist perspective, you have to ask the question, who is I? When you say I think, therefore I am, who is? And I believe that the theist view offers the most elegant and axiomatic answer to that question. So let's talk very briefly about what Christian theology, so this is Christian spirituality for the not-so-churchy. Let's talk briefly about what Christianity says about these big questions. And Christianity says that you are the imago Dei. Again, it's Latin, and it means you are the image of God. That's what you are. If you want to ask the question, who am I? Who is this being with a brain and with a body? Christianity would answer that question saying, you were created to be, in a sense, like God. And when it says be in a sense like God, it means you are a volitional, sentient being on your own, capable of free will decisions. In the first chapter of Genesis, it says God created mankind in his own image. And elsewhere we read that God is spirit. So Christianity has historically taught that people were created as spirits that occupy bodies. And all throughout Scripture, it alludes to this. In James chapter 2, it says, the body without the spirit is dead. It categorizes them as separate entities that function together. And once the spirit is gone, the body dies. When Jesus died on the cross, it says he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. And in Ecclesiastes 12, it says, remember also your Creator in the days of your youth. It says, before the silver cord is snapped, if you've ever been into astral projection or New Age theology, a lot of times they say that there's this silver cord that attaches our spirits to our bodies, and somehow that thing can be snapped, and that's when death occurs. And this isn't an idea just for New Agers. There's kind of a scriptural idea that there's this attachment between the body and the spirit, that if it's severed, death comes. And it says, when the silver cord is snapped, the spirit returns to God who gave it. And these are three of many examples in Scripture that seem to indicate that you are a spirit living in a body. So the question becomes, are we spirits having a human experience, or are we humans having a spiritual experience? And Christianity would say that you are spirits having a human experience. So if that's the case, what does that mean? What do Christians say that means as far as how you ought to live your life? Because it really does kind of change you if you start to realize I'm a spirit, that there's more to me in this life than just what I touch and feel and what my body craves and desires. There's something beyond that. There's an ancient Cherokee, I don't want to say proverb, story, and in the Cherokee story, and this is one of those stories that you hear circulated all the time, so checking the source is very challenging. And you may have heard it. But a young Indian child, young Native American child, comes to the chief of his tribe. He comes to the Cherokee chief. And he says to the chief that I keep having this vision of two wolves in my body, two wolves in my life. And he says one wolf is angry and full of hatred and bitterness and envy and is conniving and deceitful and wants to get his own way all the time. And the other wolf is kind and compassionate and merciful and loves people. And he says, I don't know which wolf is me. And he said, I don't know how. He said, how do I know which wolf will win? And the chief of the tribe says to him, the wolf that will win is the wolf that you feed. And when I've heard this example before, when Christians talk about it, when we talk about your spirit versus your flesh, your carnality, your bodily desires and functions, If you are a materialist, then naturally you're going to lean toward, and it's not to say that every materialist is angry and evil and envious and bitter. I'm not saying that at all. But the Christian concept is that we are spirits living in our body, and those two are, in a sense, at war. And oftentimes they pull us in opposite directions. So the illustration means that if you want to know how to let the right wolf win, how to be the right person you were designed to be, it means you have to feed the appropriate wolf. And to feed the appropriate wolf in this illustration means to feed your spirit. It means to figure out what it means to make your spirit strong. And you notice I haven't yet even touched on what a Christian thinks that means. I'm just saying if you come to the conclusion that maybe I am spiritual, it's like Evan Baxter in the video clip. He thinks, well, maybe God could help. Then it starts something in his life. And my point is that if you realize and you connect with the idea that you're a spiritual person, maybe you ought to start thinking about feeding that spirit and finding out what it means to do that. It's taught in Scripture that if you walk by the Spirit, you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. To close, I want to introduce you to three people. This is Karen and Tommy Wicks and their daughter. And you'll notice that she has Down syndrome. It's very clear. She was told from the very beginning that she would have a very difficult time in life. I don't know if there's degrees of Down syndrome, but I do know that she has told her story that she was told that communication would be very difficult. She was told that she would always have a hard time in life, basically. And she's managed to make a real difference in a lot of people's lives. But Karen posted a picture of her daughter on Facebook this week. She walked into her room and she snapped this picture, which is a little bit unclear and a little bit, I don't even know you can see it very well. But she caught her worshiping God. You know, nobody had told her to go worship. That's what's going on this side of the screen, if you can make it out. And caught her worshiping God. And she was doing it on her own. Here's my question. What do you suspect that worship looked like? Like her communication with God, do you suspect that it was filled with, "Thou art the most holy King of the universe. Thou shalt be my Father, and I will love thee"? Or do you think it was quite a bit more simple than that? You know, I don't know what it looked like, but I'll bet she just says things like, "I love you. I love you. I love you. I love you. I love you." I'll bet she says things like, "You're great. You're great. You're great. You're great." I don't know, and I don't know the family very well. But just like in the beginning, showing the clip of Evan Baxter from Evan Almighty, he gets down on his knees and he says the words that just make sense to him and his knowledge of who God is at that moment. It's not articulate. It's not holy. I take that back. It wouldn't sound holy to the average Joe, to the average Christian. And yet, probably heartfelt and probably putting a big smile on the face of God. And I'll bet this situation did the same. Her name's Missy, and I'll bet Missy honors God and pleases God constantly. Now, does Missy's brain function like most people's brains? It's probably very, very different on how her neurological nets fire. But her spirit, to me, looks very beautiful. And my suggestion to you is to think of Missy when it comes to what do I do with this spirituality thing. If I'm a spirit that lives in a body, what does that look like? Don't try to impress anybody. Don't try to overthink it. Take some time. Figure out what you can worship about God and give him that. If all you can say is, "Wow, being able to breathe is fascinating," then say that to him. If you're having a hard time, just admit that to him. But I'm saying if you're here and you would consider yourself maybe in the camp of the not so spiritual, my hope is that after today you will start to think of yourself differently, like who you are and what you are, what it means to be human. And then you'll start to feed that spiritual life, that you'll start to to investigate and invest in your spiritual life. John 4:24 says, God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. Our worship of God is a spiritual experience. It starts in the volition and the will and the spirit. And just like some of the illustrations we used earlier, it overtakes the brain activity. It overtakes the neurology and the neurological net and the way that it fires. Your volition can choose, in some sense, how it responds to being a spirit. And I would encourage you to lift that up to God and offer it to him and see what he does with it.